Good evening. There you go. All right. So, wow, what a beautiful crowd. So, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Samantha Samreth, and I serve as the director of the Diversity and College Access Department at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I am delighted to be with you tonight. And I will serve as the facilitator for this evening's program. So I feel that it is 4:03, and I know I value your time, so we'll get started. And with that, and I'm looking over the room and like, look at around you, it's filled. Look behind you. It is full, and we have around 80 people who's joining us virtually via Zoom. And so I'm really excited, and thank you for your time, taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening. So I just want to share with you a few things, and that on behalf of the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, welcome to our second annual Black History Month keynote speaker presentation. And this program is made possible by the Thompson Center grant. So if I want to share a few things about the Thompson Center grant. The Thompson Center is delighted to be able to sponsor tonight's event and partnering with us, the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Century School of Business and Economics, the Diversity and College Access Department, and the Continuing Education Department. So I have to give many thanks to the people who made this event possible tonight. I have to start with our first professor, Elizabeth Martin from the Century School of Business and Economics, and her interns, as well as Mara Proza and the Continuing Education team. It has been a privilege and a pleasure working with this dynamic team. I also would like to give a shout out to my DCA staff. I know they're out and about outside helping support our staff guests coming to the office here or to the room here. The Black Student Union, CASE, Residence Life, the History Department, and other campus partners for their support in offering educational and cultural events in honoring Black History Month. Next, I would like to say thank you to our Chancellor Thomas Gibson, who's right over there, for all his support. He's trying to hide. Come on, Chancellor, get up. Oh. There you go. For all his support in that, for all his support in all that we do at this fine institution. Finally, many thanks to the Thompson Center staff, Alex, Ruth, and Lily, for all their support in this program. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. They work to further these goals by offering public events such as this, funding research and scholarships, honoring exemplary public leaders with the Distinguished Public Leadership Awards, and conducting other activities across all UW campuses. All the events sponsored by the Thompson Grant are free and open to the public. For more information on their upcoming events, grant opportunities, and other aspects of the center, please visit the Thompson Center website. And we are appreciative done. So to kick off our program for this evening, I would like to welcome Dr. Anthony Andrews Jr., the campus executive for the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point Marshallfield campus, to give the opening remarks for this evening. So please help me welcome Dr. Andrews.
Let's give another hand to Dr. Sam for her and her staff creating this great event again, the second annual event. I look out and I see this full house, and I'm extremely pleased to see so many people here for this second annual Black History Month celebration. I want to thank the Chancellor, because without him, I would not be here. And I want to make sure I thank him so I'll have a campus to go back to. Thank you, Chancellor. This year, 2024, the theme for Black History Month is the art of resistance. The art of resistance. And thinking about the theme for this year, I began to think back of resistance, and I began to think of the first person who really was known worldwide for resistance. It was 1841 in a hall in New Bedford, Massachusetts. A large group of abolitionists had gathered to talk about the condition of slavery and to talk about what they could do. And there was one man who was different, just a little different than everybody was there. He was dressed nice, and he didn't say much. He was kind of in the back until someone called him forward. That man's name was Frederick Douglass. He became a spokesperson for those who were enslaved. He wrote a narrative because many people just couldn't understand how a Black man could speak the way he spoke. His hair was different. He dressed different. They didn't understand it. They said he can't have been a slave. So he wrote a book. He called it a pamphlet. It was a narrative about his life as a slave and how he escaped slavery. Well, that made him a marked man because, of course, then they realized that he was an escaped slave. And so then there were people who wanted to take him back to a life of slavery. He risked his life because he wanted to show people that a person who had been enslaved could overcome that condition and be something different, something greater. Fast forward to 1926, when Carter G. Woodson, the great scholar, Carter G. Woodson, decided that there should be a week to celebrate the history of Negroes. And they called it Negro History Week. And they set the date in early February so that it would be coinciding with the person they called the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, and with the other great resistor, Frederick Douglass. Since then, we have learned a lot about the art of resistance, whether it be through literature or music. And in fact, in 1976, we then declared February Black History Month. Throughout the years, we have had poets, we have had dancers, we have had all types of people in the literary arts, authors like James Baldwin, talk about resistance and how we could resist together. Today we have a speaker who will be introduced soon, who falls in that line of authors. That speaker, Mr. Alvin Hall, I'm sorry. I thought about somebody who was actually, I think you've heard about him. A gentleman who is actually another type of resistor in New York, where I come from. We'll have Mr. Alvin Hall come and talk a little bit about his book, and we'll, I'm sure, hear a little bit about resistance. I thank you very much for attending today's event, and I thank you, Dr. Sam, for having me as an introductory speaker. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew, for that really historical opening remarks. So thank you so much. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Marka Lewis, the Associate Lecturer and Doctor of Education Program Global Affiliate Scholar, and a Ho-Chunk Nation member to the stage to give the Indigenous Land Recognition Statement. Please help me welcome Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, and happy Black History Month, y'all. Come on. We got an extra day this year. So Thanks for the invitation to offer the Indigenous Land Recognition Statement. So again, my name is Dr. Marcus Lewis, and I'm an alumnus of UWSP, COFAC graduate, class of 2007, and it's really my honor and privilege and pleasure to also be teaching part-time here, and also to, as both a Black man and a Ho-Chunk man, to have the opportunity to honor my both parts of my culture tonight. It's really exciting, so I thank you for the invitation. So for tonight's land statement, I'll read it first in Ho-Chunk, and then I'll read it in English. University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point Nangre, Ho-Chunk ma nagakari ma hami nunk, wau nunkra hi pedaswi. Hakoch unksh uwianaga, Ho-Chunk akra nagakari shakra, manangre hach ida shununa hidakaragi jump wagaje. Egi wong shikaja Hawaii jireda, ma wakan chunk haninena hirasa wagaje. The University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee peoples. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land upon which this institution sits and sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. Hanan Shwa Ini Gampui. Thank you.
All right, I got my workout today, so thank you, Dr. Lewis, so much for that Indigenous Land Recognition Statement. So at this time, I'm so excited to introduce you Damien Luriano, our first-year lead program student majoring in English, to come up to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. So please welcome Damien to the stage. Damien, come on up. Woo!
I think we can see the height difference. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I need more than that. Good evening, everyone. Perfect. Happy Black History Month. So I'm honored to have this opportunity to introduce our Black History Month keynote speaker. In reviewing his background, he has so many accolades that it would probably take the entire program to introduce him. But here are some of the following highlights that his impressive work experience has. So Alvin Hall is many things. He's an award-winning television and radio broadcaster, best-selling author, and renowned financial educator. Some of his radio programs include The Green Book, which was on BBC Radio 4, Alvin Hall Goes Back to School, which was on The Takeaway, PRI with WNYC, and has gotten the award for Best Radio General Feature of the New York Association of Black Journalists. Also had Who Sold the Soul, which was also on BBC Radio 4, and has gotten the award for Best Music Feature or Documentary, and my personal favorite, Jay-Z from Brooklyn to the Boardroom, which has gotten the award for Best Radio Program off of the Wincott Foundation Press and Broadcasting. Some of his television work includes the landmark BBC Two television series, Your Money or Your Life, which has gotten the winner of the Personal Finance Program of the Year. And he's also had Alvin's Guide to Good Business, which was featured the work of 8 social entrepreneurs in Africa, Asia, and the US. And finally, among the books, Hall has written Getting Started in Stocks, Getting Started in Mutual Funds, and Your Money or Your Life, which is the award winner for W.H. Smith People's Choice Award, and has gotten the award nomination for NAACP Image. And he's also written his children's book, Show Me the Money, that has been published in 20 foreign languages. He continues to write for various publications in the UK and the US and is completing a memoir of his childhood in Florida Panhandle. He currently serves on the Bowdoin College Museum of Art Advisory Council, the Studio Museum of Harlem's Acquisition Committee, and the Board of Conservation US, and is also the co-chair of MoMA's Friends of Education. So please give me a warm welcome for Alvin Hall to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so honored to be here to celebrate Black History Month to you. with you. When I was given this opportunity, I was totally thrilled because I love an adventure. And I had never been to Stevens Point. I had never been to central Wisconsin. So this is a real treat for me. And look at the beautiful weather that greeted me. Could it be better? And all morning I was thinking about the words of James Baldwin, who said, a journey is a journey because you don't know what you can find. And you don't know what you find, you don't know what you will find and how it will affect you. And so my Green Book journey, I'm going to share it with you, but I'm also going to talk to you about stories that I was shared during my trip. It was really a fantastic experience overall. I did not know about the Green Book at all. I was raised in the Florida Panhandle on a big farm that my family has owned since 1869, and we were poor. As I like to say, we were po. We couldn't even afford the O-R in the word. And so we grew everything that we ate. I did not know that eggs came from a store until I was around 9 or 10 years old. That's how self-sufficient we were. And the only time we took trips was to go up to Thomasville, Georgia, to visit my uncle Aubrey James. So we had no need for a car, and we couldn't afford a car. When we drove up there, it was always my uncle's son who took us there. And then we would come back the same way. So it is ironic that I first became aware of the Green Book when I was on a flight to London to film a television show. And I'm sitting in business class reading, the Green Book? What is this? I'm an educated black man, right? I don't know what this book is, and I really didn't. So I said to myself, as soon as I returned to New York City, I would go to the Schomburg Center for Research into Black Culture and see what they had in this. And lo and behold, as they say in the Bible, they have the largest collection of the Negro Motorist Green Book in America. And at the time, you could spread them out on a table. It was amazing. So these are some of the covers that I have up here that were from, and I chose them by decade because they really reflect what was happening with this publication over time. The first one, when he started the publication in 1936, only covered basically New England and a little bit of the South, because that's where Victor and his friends went on their holidays. By 1938, they expanded it up to the Mississippi. After 1938, it then started to expand across America. And you can see how the cover changed each time. Note also that the name changed. At first, it was called the Green Book. Then it was called the Negro Traveler's Green Book. And then it was called the Traveler's Green Book. So the name did not stay the same over its publication life. But it was named after Victor Hugo Green. And Victor was an interesting man. I love this picture of Victor so that you now have an image in your head. At the top, we have Victor and his wife, Alma, who founded the Green Book, and progressive for that time, they had an all-female staff to work on the Negro Motorist Green Book. Victor was a postman in Hackensack, New Jersey, and he would, during the day, gather information about places where black people could stay. What was his motivation? It was the trips that he and Alma would take to the South every summer. She was from Richmond, Virginia. When they were there, they were driving there, they would often encounter what he called aggravations and frustrations. They could not buy gasoline anywhere they stopped. They could not get food. They could not go to the bathroom. They could not stay in hotels. And so rather than just accept this, Victor decided to engage in an act of resistance. I will not accept this. Instead, I will create a publication that will help black people find safe places, find the services that they want. So part of what enabled this was his job. He was a postman, and he was connected to a white postman's union, which was very unusual at that time. There was a black postman's union and a white postman's union. Victor was with the white postman's union, so he asked them to gather information. But he also connected to the black postman, and they gathered information from their routes about places that should be in the Green Book. Additionally, he also tapped into the Pullman porters who traveled all around the country. That's the way they distributed the Green Book. So they brought back information about places in local areas that should be advertised or listed in the Green Book. Of course, what was the first thing I did when I got the Green Book? I went and looked at the ads that are in the Green Book. And I put this up so you can see. The Green Book contains state-by-state listings, alphabetical, and then city-by-city listings, also alphabetical. But at the back, it had the ads. And I love these ads because they point to a certain history here. You have the Lenox Lounge. Anybody who came to Harlem more than 10 years ago, the Lenox Lounge was legendary for music, for bars, for drinks and everything. And it was around for years. Even a company or a place as famous as that advertised in the Green Book. On the left-hand corner, you have a typical sort of tourist house where people would take their own homes. Their brothers would be traveling or off to war, or an uncle had moved away and that an extra room. So as a tourist home, you could come and stay there overnight. And they cooked great food for everybody. So that was a typical business, very much like Airbnb. But on the right-hand side at the bottom, you have Vernon Shaky Terry's Esso service station. This opened up a whole world that I did not know. Esso was the first service station company in America, petrol company, to let African Americans buy franchises. At one point, of the 850 franchises it had, 315 were owned by African Americans. And African Americans knew that these were places where we could stop and use the bathroom and buy gas without being hassled. More importantly, Esso did not require that all their stations do this, but many of them did. Why Esso? Because it was owned by the Rockefeller family. And they were legendary people for their advocacy of abolition and education for black people. Most people don't know that Spelman College in Atlanta is actually named after Laura Spelman Rockefeller, who put up the money, and the Rockefeller put up great monies for the funding of the NAACP and the National College Fund. So these are some ads that were in there. And then you have ads like this, in which you have that would have been a billboard. Many times driving down the road, African Americans were really creative. They would just have the face of the person who owned it up there so that you would know this would be the last place you could stop before you hit a part of the town where you would not be able to buy gas. And then they had a little cartoon called GB promoting the Green Book. So these things just kept opening up worlds for me. Imagine driving down the road and seeing that lady's face on a big billboard. The people who really perfected this was a group of entrepreneurs in Opelousas, Louisiana. They knew that once you left New Orleans and headed west, which was where a lot of black people migrated from during that period of time to San Francisco and Oakland, the drive from Louisiana to the nearest place where you could find services was 1,100 miles. The first stop was the La Luz Motel in El Paso, Texas. Along that road, there was hostility. There were very few places to stop. We interviewed people who just drove it continually. They would have gas in the back of the car. They'd have all the food in the back of the car, places to sleep. They would stop only to go to the woods, as they would say, beside the road, but they kept going because it was so dangerous. There are also stories of people who became so tired that they had wrecks along the roads. There were always reports of those. So black people decided that they were willing to take the risk of being on the road in order to migrate from the Deep South. Now, of course, when I saw the Green Book spread on that table in front of me, what did I do? I went immediately to the place where I was born, Tallahassee, Florida. Right? I was born in the Deep South and in this little back roads country place, and lo and behold, there was a little place called the Abner, Virginia Motel. I had lived in Tallahassee, Florida, till I was 16 years old. I had no clue that this place existed at all. And so we drove there with the film crew and the recording crew, and this is what we found. And this is not unusual. All across America, many of these places are now either torn down, or they are Section 8 housing, or they are rehabilitation centers for youth, or they are halfway houses when they still exist. Especially on the West Coast, that is true. So this is what we found during that period of time. And then we looked again, and in Tallahassee, there was another place, Tukes Tourist House, owned by a couple, and they would rent out rooms in the house. Again, like many black people, I did not know that these places were right in my backyard. These pictures come from the very first Green Book show that I did, which you can still access on the BBC's website. It was simply called The Green Book. This show came about because of that plane trip. When I got back to America, I did my research, and then out of the blue, a producer from BBC Wales calls me and said, I just read about the Green Book, and I think it'd make a great program. And I said, I'm in, that's it. And the BBC said yes in less than a month. And we then had to come up with a concept, because the BBC is very specific about wanting these types of history programs to have some connection to today. So what we did, we conceived of it as a move or a trip through space and time. The space would be from Tallahassee, Florida, following the historic civil rights route through Montgomery, Selma, Jackson, Memphis, but we would end in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown had recently been murdered. So, and that was also the trip through time from my past to current events. So we saw this program, we created this program based on that narrative. The program came out. It was so successful, and it was broadcast in every country but one. And guess which one that was? I went around, I was on so many radio shows talking about the program, hoping somebody would pick up the program. Nobody did. So rather than getting depressed or bitter and twisted about this, I thought, I can turn this into something positive. And luck happened to me when I went to an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City about Jacob Lawrence's 60 painting series called The Migration. And in that series, and in this exhibition, they had this infographic at the very beginning of the exhibition. And I would walk past it and look at it, and it shows how much the African American population in cities across America had changed because of the Great Migration. And one day, going back to see the show, perhaps the third or fourth time, I noticed Detroit. That Detroit's African American population was approximately 1.2% in 1910. Fast forward to 1970, it is 43.7%, the largest increase of any city in America. And that gave me the aha moment to say, I can do this show. All of these people who came to Detroit to work in the automobile industry and related industries had to go back to the South for funerals, for weddings, to see Mama, to see Uncle James. They had to go back. And so they had to take the risk of driving back to the South. That became the next BBC series for the Green Book. And it also became the podcast. The BBC didn't accept it, so we turned it into a podcast, a 10-episode podcast. And here we have the routes. And let me tell you, we had to shoot this like a movie. Because we only had a limited budget, we had to record all of the interviews in 12 days. That's all the budget would allow. We drove 2,021 miles in 12 days. And what you have here are the various routes that people took. And so you can see we went from Detroit. We did not stop in Toledo, but we stopped in Cincinnati. We stopped in Columbus, Louisville, Nashville, Memphis. We did all the way down to New Orleans to interview people about this. And we conceived of this as a simple road trip in which we would look for places that had been listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book. We would talk to people who lived in those neighborhoods, and we'd capture stories of on-the-road experiences during that time. My first day of recording in Detroit, we're with a historian, Jamon Jordan, who's taking us around, looking at places. We see Black Bottom, a place that anybody who's been to Detroit, it doesn't exist anymore. The building of the interstate highway system was routed straight through this hugely successful business area. It wasn't a slum, it was a hugely successful business area. And there is a plaque, about a 24 by 24 inch plaque. That's all that remains of Black Bottom. And that story became something we heard again and again and again. While the narrative was urban renewal and slum clearance, every Black person we met said it was nothing more than Negro removal. That's what everyone said. It was across the board. And we saw Black Bottom, we saw all these areas. And then we went to Motown. Of course, you go to Detroit, you have to go to Motown. And I wondered, what was it like for musicians on the road? And we met this wonderful man, Mackenzie Jackson. And he was so generous. He described his dream was to work at Motown. So at 15, he dropped out of school. And on his first day at Motown, he was put into a session with the legendary Smokey Robinson. And the song that he played on, and you can still hear it today, has the lyrics, "I did you wrong, my heart went out to play, but in the game I lost you, what a price to pay." Does anybody know which song that is? Ooh, Baby, Baby. That is one of Smokey's legendary songs. And when you hear that, you can hear Mackenzie Jackson's saxophone on that song to this day. And he opened up the world for us about what it was like for musicians to be on the road, right? They would be traveling a part of the Motown Review. They always traveled with the white person because they knew they could not go in and get food. So the white guy had to go in and get the food. And if the proprietor saw that the bus was full of Black people, then more than likely the food would have grime from the grill in it and they'd have to throw it out. They also described experiences of being on the road where they would be driving down a road in the South because they did one-night gigs, and somebody there a group of people on a haystack would point rifles at the Motown bus. But as he said, what they didn't know was that the Four Tops and the Temptations carried pistols, because they were always concerned. So all of a sudden, out of every window, an arm would come out with a pistol pointing at the place, and the car would then speed along. So he talked about the fact that for them, going to the South was eye-opening because they had no idea about how different the South was from the North. They had essential freedom. They were not used to Jim Crow laws. So for them, these were always challenging times, but they said the music made a huge difference in what they saw. But this lady, when we got to Columbus, Georgia, opened my eyes to a part of the world that I never existed. You know, when you think about this, I go back to that statement, you never know what these journeys are going to do to you. Mary Ellen Tyus had been going to an all-Black resort all of her life for the entire summer. Her grandmother had gone there, her mother had gone there in Idlewild, Michigan. It was considered the Black Eden. And they're all over America. I had no idea that these places existed. High-achieving Black professionals, doctors, nurses, lawyers, all these people, teachers, would go to these places so they could be away from the white gaze, so they would not be, a word I learned, Jim Crowed when they were on a holiday. And she described what it was like. Everywhere they looked, there were only Black people enjoying themselves. Della Reese used to go there. The Four Tops spent a great deal of time there. Barbara McNair, all of these major stars would go to these places. There was Fox Lake in Angola, Indiana. There is American Beach in Maryland. There was one in Florida. These were all over the US where Black people would retreat so they could refuel. Typically, the parents, the mother, and the children would go for the entire summer. And then the husbands would go back and forth. I wrote a chapter in the book about this, and a friend of mine who now lives in LA, this section brought back an incredible memory. They used to drive every summer from St. Louis, Missouri to Middlesex County in Virginia, where his mother and father were from. The mother would go out for the summer with the kids, and then the father would go back and forth. And during one of these drives, he said everything was fun. He said the first day, like all black people, they packed the shoebox lunch. Fried chicken, potato salad, tea cakes. Everybody rhapsodizes about the shoebox lunch. And they just love the food. But this was a long drive. And there was one restaurant in Wheeling, West Virginia, where they could stop. It was the Big Boy. And he talked about the Big Boy in the most rhapsodic way. Where was I yesterday? In Wheeling, West Virginia. And so what I did, I took a picture of the Big Boy sign and sent it to him, and he was overjoyed. But his story also contained something that was deeply moving. One night, his sister was very sick in the car, and they stopped at a whites-only motel along the road. And his parents were determined not to take no for an answer. So they were an act of resistance. The hotel owner called the local police sheriff to come and arrest them. And when the police got there, he saw how sick Larry's sister was and said, "You will give these people a room at this hotel. This young girl is sick. She needs a doctor." And then he went and got the white doctor to bring them back to the hotel and save their sister's life. So even in the midst of that, there were people who were generous all the time. But Mary Ellen was so wonderful. I asked her, what was a perfect day like in Idlewild? She said they'd get up in the morning and they'd go out in their boats on the water. They'd play with friends. The parents would make lunch for them. She said it was full of joy. Then the fire department, that a local department, would ring the bell. Everybody would come home. And then they'd dress in the evening and go out to the roller rink or about the pool and have hot dogs. And she said it was like this all summer long. Recently, young white people have discovered Idlewild, and there was a whole narrative. Idlewild had become a place of drug dealers and prostitutes, but that's not true. The families are there, and more young African Americans are now buying into this place to protect it. Here is a picture of Idlewild. You can see the Idlewild clubhouse in the background and the people enjoying themselves. And this is a picture from the area that was started by Frederick Douglass's son in Maryland, where my friend Larry, who lives in California, just bought a house last year. So I'm going to this area for the first time, and it's still largely black in those areas. But in most places we went to along this road trip, this is what it looked like in its heyday, but here is what it looks like now. Most of these places are subject to being abandoned by the local city, and they don't do any work to keep them up. It was so interesting that anytime I do a talk like this, I look through the Green Book to see what was in your town, what was here. And guess what? It was never listed. Stevens Point was never listed in the Green Book, but there was a lot in Milwaukee. I mean, one year in 1954, there were almost 110 places listed in Milwaukee. Fond du Lac had some places. Where else? I can't remember all the places. Yes, I have them written down. Madison had a great number of places. Oshkosh even had a few places. But it was Milwaukee that was the center. But most of these places are gone. All of these streets were known collectively as Little Harlems, because this was the place where African Americans came to enjoy the best of what they could at that time in their communities. They had worked hard all week, whether the job was menial or the job was important, but they wanted to have a good time. There was Walnut Street in Louisville, Kentucky. There was the Avenue in Mobile, Alabama. There's Jefferson Street in Nashville. And this is Ferris Street in Jackson, Mississippi. And this was a wonderful place. We ran into a shoe shine guy who owned a business on the street. And he described what it was like. He'd say, all of these people from the country, they had been catching chickens or they had been, milking cows. But on the weekend, they took their money and they came to Ferris Street. And every time we heard, if you had not been to Ferris Street, you had not been to Walnut Street, you had not been to the Avenue, then you had not been to that city, because that was the heart of the black community. Of course, one of the places listed in the Green Book was the Lorraine Motel. And it was listed in there for years because it was a safe haven for African Americans. When we did the podcast, I've been there now 3 times. When we did the podcast, one of the things that emerged was sort of a 360-degree view of this. I'm borrowing that phrase from Lee, who is right there, of the whole, the history of the Lorraine Motel. It was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences we had. We all know what happened there on April 4th, 1968. But what we don't know is that on that day, Walter's wife, Loree Bailey, was on the switchboard. She was directing the calls to bring in all of the people, the emergency care workers. She said to her person sitting next to her, "I don't feel very well. I'm going to go upstairs and lie down." Probably the pressure of it all. She went upstairs and never came back. She had an aneurysm on the day that Martin Luther King was shot at the Lorraine. That is unknown. She died on the day of his funeral. So it is astonishing that that story is not well known. The Baileys started the hotel and bought the hotel in 1945. And over the years, we've been trying to figure out how did they fund the expansion of this hotel? They built a second story. They put in a pool. Recently, I'm working on a film, and we found pictures of people from Stax Records at the pool, because Stax Record was only 10 minutes away. So you have Isaac Hayes, you have Rufus Thomas, you have Mavis Staple and the Staples Singles. We find pictures of Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke together checking into the Lorraine Motel. It's fantastic, right? So the history of this place is far bigger than anybody knew. When Walter and Loree Bailey could not get the quality of produce that they wanted from the local merchants, what did they do? They went and bought a farm in Shelby County, and they grew the quality of what they wanted. They then went to local black farmers and set up a quiet co-op so they could bring in what they wanted. And the restaurant became legendary. People would come there, including Mahalia Jackson, because the food was so good. After Martin Luther King was assassinated there, it went downhill. Walter tried to hold on to it, but he couldn't hold on. And eventually, the white man from whom he had taken a loan forced him into bankruptcy. The judge decided that the Lorraine should be auctioned on the courthouse steps. I believe in my heart that this was designed to really humiliate Walter Bailey, who was still alive. But the black community wasn't going to take it. They weren't going to let the Lorraine be raised from the face of this earth. So, working with several local people, they were able to raise the money, and 4 key local people helped save the Lorraine Motel. They were able to guarantee a loan, knowing that the white businessman was only going to bid up to $142,000. Bids came around on the day of the auction. We have pictures of the auction taking place. They bid $142,000. He decided to bid $143,000, sure that $1,000 was going to get him it. Little did he know, they had more money. They were able to save the Lorraine with a bid of $144,000. That is just the most amazing story. It's on the courthouse step. It was so important that we found footage of Dan Rather reporting it on the CBS Evening News. That's what a big deal it was. And it was going to be turned into the Civil Rights Museum, which is what it is today. Today, you will more than likely see the Lorraine when you see conferences for the Tennessee Three, because one of them, Justin Pearson, often uses it as background when he gives a talk. This is just one of those iconic places along the road. Here's what exists of some of the places: Sumner's Hotel and Subway Lounge. Again, this is what exists for many people of these places along the way. However, in every one of these communities, one thing remains: the funeral home. Now, we know that funeral homes are successful, but there's another reason a funeral home exists. And when I was looking through the listings for Milwaukee, one of the first things they had was the undertaker. Why the undertaker? Black people traveling through the South were taught one lesson, many lessons, but traveling. You arrive in a town where you don't know anybody and there's no place to live or stay. Where do you go? The funeral home. Why? Because the funeral home will let you sleep there. We have this wonderful sequence that's in the book and it's in the podcast, where in the BBC program, where we meet Mr. Collins, who owns Collins Funeral Home. And he's 80 years old sitting there, and we go in, and Mr. Collins, so I interviewed him, he said, "Yep, people stay here all the time." I tell them, if nobody's bothered you out there, they sure not gonna bother you back here. I've been here for close to 50 years and nobody's bothered me. I love that sequence. And then we interviewed people who talked about actually staying in funeral homes. And it's also legendary that a lot of gospel singers would stay in funeral homes if they got stuck in town and needed a place to stay. And in Montgomery, Alabama, we have the A.G. Gaston Motel. This was one of the most impressive places in America. It is currently being stored, but here is a postcard of what the A.G. Gaston looked like. In this case, most of these places were built on the Holiday Inn model. So they wanted to have a great restaurant, drive-in service. You drive in through the overpass, and then everything opened up. The A.G. Gaston was also the place where Martin Luther King and all of the people, including Dr. Fred Shuttlesworth, planned the protests that were key to the civil rights movement in Birmingham. If you look at the bottom photograph up on the left, just beyond the sign, that was room 30. It was known as the War Room. It's where they planned the protests in the nearby park that resulted in the pictures where the kids were hosed with water. That's where they planned all of that. So this is very important. Now, we look at the hotels, but I want you to think about one thing. It wasn't when you were at the hotel where you were in trouble. It wasn't when you were at your home where you faced danger. It was all that time in between, when you were on the road as an African American. Today, we don't remember how bad those laws were for Jim Crow and segregation. In some states, any white person could stop any black person for any reason. It didn't make any difference. In some states, a black person couldn't pass white people in a car. You couldn't drive too close to them in a car, or they could stop you. So we heard so many shared stories about what happened to people on the road. I'm going to share two of them, which still haunt me to this day. One is with Senator Hank Saunders, who lives in Selma, Alabama. He was the first senator elected to the Alabama legislature since Reconstruction. Since Reconstruction, the first one. That's years, decades and decades. And he recalls during the civil rights movement how there was a white lady who was working with them, and she lives 20 miles north in the direction that he had to go. The organizers asked him if he would drive her up. And as he said yes. But at the same time he said yes, his instincts told him he should say no. They got into the car, they pulled out, driving north. Within 5 minutes after pulling out, a pickup truck, he says, the kind that you know has rifles in the back, pulled up. As he would speed up, it would speed up. As he would slow down, it would slow down. And he said he knew that sitting in the front seat with a white woman in the car was going to be dangerous. He slowed down and slowed down until eventually the car pulled up beside him. He was convinced that the guys were going to pull out the shotgun and just kill them right there. But instead, they looked into the car, made a face, and drove on. And in which case, the other fear came into place. What if they're setting a trap for me ahead? Do I drive on, or do I turn around and go back? But he decided in that moment that he had to resist that fear. He had to go on. And so he drove on and delivered the white people home. But then he was also concerned about maybe they'd recognize his license plate. Maybe they would set a trap along. So this was this was typical of that period of time. It sounds almost like a psychological horror movie if you think about something that Hitchcock would have put together in a movie. That's what that sounds like to me. The other story that I always remember was given to me by the late Dr. Gwen Patton, who taught at Tuskegee and was a student at Tuskegee. And she said that her father just bought a new 8-cylinder Oldsmobile and was driving for the south from Detroit. And they were cruising along and they saw this cop car coming at them. And the father said, don't look at the car, look away, make no eye contact with everybody in the car. So they all looked away. But her father kept looking in the rearview mirror and saying, I have a bad feeling about this. I have a bad feeling about this. And eventually he was driving around a big turn and he saw the cop car in the back coming after him. And he decided with his new V8, he'd gun that car. And he took off down the road at the speed of lightning. And he kept thinking and thinking. And then he remembered there was a Black Baptist church on this road. And so he slowed down enough so he wouldn't leave any dust. And they pulled off behind the Black Baptist church near the outhouses. And there they sat and they saw the car go up the road and back down the road, but never imagining. And they waited until midnight until they drove off. And even then, her father was really terrified of what could happen to them. Right? So these were the experiences that people had between these safe places. And sometimes, even once you reach the safe place, you'd have a horrible on-the-road experience. Detroit. I told this story this morning about Hezekiah Jackson's family going up to Detroit to pick up to attend his Aunt Beatty's funeral, and how his Aunt Beatty's husband didn't have a car, so they had to drive into the white section of Detroit. Now, what most people don't realize is that you've heard of sundown towns. Detroit had sundown suburbs. A lot of suburbs in Detroit were completely sundown, and this is what they drove into. When you listen to the podcast, it's a beautiful evocation of what happened. Before they could even get out of the car, the police pulled up out of nowhere, saying, "What are you doing here, boy? Where did that nice car come from, boy? You work for did you steal that car? Or did your white people who you work for give you that car, lend you that car?" And this was traumatic for his brother. His brother was sitting in the back seat. They were looking at the side mirror, and their mother had her finger placed ever so slightly, like she was thinking, but she was using it to tell them to stay quiet. And Hezekiah says she had probably done that so many times. It looks like you're thinking, but you're saying, don't say a word. But his brother said, "Do you hear that white man calling people boy? He's calling daddy boy." They respected their father so much that they would never do that. Their father would never let anybody do that. The policeman made the father get back into the car. He went up to the door, got the check, and then dropped it in his father's lap. And they drove off. Of course, the car was silent, and the kids wanted to know what had happened. The mother said, "Oh, nothing. Let us study our Bible lessons for next Sunday." That's the way she deflected. That was a common deflection. So that type of story exists everywhere. But even amid all of this, one of the great joys was how humorous. There was so much fun that Black people had on the road when they were traveling. The songs they would sing, the comments they would make. It was quite joyful in so many ways. And even memories of places like the Dunbar Hotel in Jackson, this in Jackson? No, this is in Birmingham. No, Montgomery. This is in Montgomery. Sorry about that. In Montgomery. This was a place that was the place to be. And you look at it today and it's all run down, but it had the skylight across the top. It was on the highest hill in Montgomery, and you could see all over the place. And Gwen Patton described how they would go up there and there would be music. They had an elevator man named Cat Wiley, and they would have their libations. That's what she used the term, libations. And so there were all these places where they had fellowship. And by the way, this was one of the places where Ike and Tina Turner regularly played when they came there. And this is what remains in the hotel today. It has been my campaign for years to get the Smithsonian Museum of American History and Culture to buy that interior, right? Isn't it fabulous? It's singular. It represents a real element, a real succinct, something that all of us who are Black have gone into a barbershop and we've experienced that, all that cultural information, all of these things put together in this shop. And this was the place where Martin Luther King got his hair cut. And we interviewed the guy who cut Martin Luther King. But all during the trip, no, I love food. I love food. So in every town, we went to Black-owned restaurants when we could find them, and we had some incredible food along the way. But the food we really, really wanted was Dookie Chase. How many of you have ever been there? Oh my God, a couple of hands, yes, you've been. It's singular, isn't it? Singular in New Orleans. It has been advertising in the Green Book at the same location, a Black-owned restaurant, for decades. And it was our Valhalla for this trip. We were so looking for it. We were going to have first, we were going to eat 2 meals, right, at one time. We were going to eat the typical schoolhouse, the school box lunch, and then we were going to go and have a real big Cajun food. We walked up to the desk, and I said, we have a reservation at 1 o'clock. And the lady said, sir, we have no reservation. I turned to the producer and said, did you make a reservation? Yeah, I did. Sir, we have no reservation. And then you know that look, when they look up at you and right? It was one of those looks you just know you're not going to get past. And then I remembered, I was raised in a small southern town. And one of the things you were taught were extreme good manners. In the worst situation, you can pull something out. So I said, ma'am, and all of a sudden I became a little Southern. And I said, ma'am, we've driven a long way. We've been doing this Green Book trip. Here is the book. Oh, she said, and I said, and note, there's a little sticker next to Dookie Chase. So we were coming here. Ma'am, I promise that if you give us a table, we'll be done in 75 minutes. She looked at me and went, you have 90. I just gave us a table immediately. It was a great joy of our lives. So this was our treat. All along this trip, we thought we were recording incidences about on-the-road experiences, the joy, the sadness, the fun times. But what we ended up with was a record of the first-person stories of a generation of African Americans, many of whom had never shared those stories with anybody. In many cases, we were the first sort of professional people to come and connect with them. I was asked recently, how was it that you got them to tell you these stories? Because when we were planning this production, which took about 3 months, about 6 months, we had to get all these interviews in place before we got on the road. So there was no chance. We'd get on the phone and I would just be me. I always say one of the things that I've never lost is the fact that I was a small Southern boy in a little bitty area in the South, so I can always go back to that. When I used to travel around the world, I go back home, my parents, by the way, and my parents did not call me Alvin. You can be sure I have a nickname the way everybody in the South has a nickname. And so I would go back to that. So for us, what this Green Book journey became and what the book is, it is a memory. It is a recollection of stories that will show how people survived, how they resisted. Think of this, that the Green Book was an act of resistance, but it was also an act of resilience. It's saying, yes, we may be restricted from the road to the American dream, but we will create our own path. We will create our own happiness, our own joys, and we will experience that in our own communities strongly and totally, and not think about what's going on in the outside world. Most importantly, of the 50 interviews I've done for this book, you will hear no vengeance. You'll hear no sense of revenge. Everybody recognized what the times were, and they were focused on making sure that their children had the opportunities to dream big, to dream free of anger. In a wonderful interview in Birmingham, one of the two that really touched me a great deal, and one that I experienced but didn't realize, about how protective Black parents were of their children. When I grew up, we didn't have very much contact with white people because it was segregation. We just, we lived here and it was fine. But there was no discussion about segregation in the house, as I remember. And I've asked my mother about this. She said, no, we didn't have to talk about it because you kind of knew it. But when we would go to Tallahassee, they were worried that we as children would somehow run into a white person and cause a consternation. So Black people would do this, what I call waltz. You have your child, and a white person is walking towards your child. You would say, oh, honey, look over here at that steeple. Isn't that pretty? And go look at that. And then they'd gradually move over to the side, so they would place themselves between the child and the white person. I call it the waltz. And every Black family talked about this. Once we opened that door, we heard so many children and so many adults talk about how they protected their children and how they wanted their children's heart to be free of anger so they could dream and open up. And I want you to think about one word when you think about the Green Book. Yes, it's a history of Black entrepreneurship in these towns and cities. In many places, the entrepreneurs are women who opened up their businesses. And even when they didn't have access to capital, they struggled to keep businesses going. And things did not go well after integration occurred. These people exhibited one word: grace. They knew inside that tomorrow would be better than today. They believed and they worked toward it. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alvin Hall, for that inspirational, historical history about African American experience in the United States. So let's give him another hand of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm so taken. So at this point, we do have a Q&A session until like 5:25. So I do have two staff members. I think Rachel's right there to get a mic, and then James coming up to get a mic. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and they will go and give you the mic for your questions.
And I want to encourage you to ask me anything, because there's so much more I could share. I always think about, if I give sort of two speeches, really. One in which there's more of a public speech, and then there's another speech I give when it's a smaller group. So you can ask me any question, I'll share with you any knowledge that I have. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you.
You're welcome.
And this Dookie Chase, just that picture is making me very hungry. You know that they have a show, there's a show on PBS that features a family.
Yes, I do. Yeah, and what's her face? I forget her name. She died 3 weeks before we arrived.
Oh.
And so there was still the black ribbon and the memorial to her in the restaurant when we were there.
So there are several parts of your presentation reminded me of my family and my childhood. My family is originally from Toledo, Ohio, but they would go to Idlewild quite a bit.
Oh, wow.
And it is sorely missed among the folks in my family. But in any case, so I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, in the early 2000s. And I was looking at the map that you had earlier about the trip from Detroit down to New Orleans. And looking at that journey, it reminded me of the many trips that I would take between Toledo and Nashville.
Yep.
And how terrified I was in the early 2000s to make that journey, and how the time it took me to figure out where I was safe to stop along the ways, along that way. So I'm curious about, like, when you did that journey, were there ever moments today where you didn't feel safe making that trip back and forth?
So this was a concern when we started this project. When I did the first road trip from Tallahassee to Ferguson, the BBC white producer drove all the way because I wasn't going to drive that. However, for the trip from Detroit down, Janée and I drove. My friend, and this is Janée, who was my associate producer on the trip. We were concerned because we were 3 Black people from 3 different generations in this car. And it was a nice car. And we worried all the way, but we decided not to talk about it. Unbeknownst to me, Janée would get up every day before we took off and check to make sure all the lights were working. Everything was fine about the car. Because when I was driving, she was worried that if we got stopped, that I would be in more trouble than she would be. The 3 of us who were on the trip, I was born in segregation in the South, so I'm the Southerner. Janée, who is here, is biracial. Her mother is white, her father Black, and he left the Massachusetts town before she was born and settled someplace else. And so she was raised in a town as the only Black person in that town. And so she knew the bullet points of Black history. And then the 3rd was the field producer, Oluwakemi Aladesuyi, who was born in England, raised in Nigeria, and then migrated with her parents to Springfield, Illinois. So she had no experience with this history. So that was a choice that I personally made because I wanted to have those perspectives with me on the trips about danger. And it was so interesting how the 3 of us reacted to certain perceptions of danger, where some things that happened to Kemi, one thing in particular, was so traumatic to her on the road that she couldn't talk about it for 3 days, 2 or 3 days. So there were dangers, but we didn't have any we didn't talk about the word. We thought if we said it, it would become real. Other question? Yes.
Thank you.
Dalton, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
You can tell I go to high school.
Yes. So one question that I had, with all these presentations, it's made me really want to read the Green Book as well. Do you know if there's any easily accessible online copies of it for free?
All of them, the entire Schomburg's collection of the New York Public Library, nypl.org, and you can put in the Green Book, and every one of them is there. They've scanned the entire collection, and so you can go on and do it. Yes, it's perfect. It's perfect. Yep. Yes, right here, lady in green. Yep, you. Yep. They're going to bring them up.
You talked about the danger to the travelers, of course. What about the people who owned the businesses? I thought about that woman with her face and name right there on the billboard. That must have been an issue.
That's something that I should talk about more. One of the things about segregation, out of sight, out of mind. So it was unimaginable to most white people at that time that Black people even had this guide. It was unimaginable. In all of the talks I've given across America, only one white person had ever used the guide. He was an old friend of mine, actually, and he had been raised in the South. When his parents traveled, they traveled with the nanny and the housekeeper. And when they went to visit relatives in the South, she couldn't stay with them, so they used the Green Book to find her places to stay at night. That is the only time. When I started doing this project, my neighbors in New York City, in the building where I live, they were just amazed. They said, "What is this project?" White people would look at that billboard and didn't see that billboard. They would see these things. It was just not something that was a part of their register, because segregation literally means out of sight, out of mind. People are in their place, you don't have to think about them. So they never cross. It was only, you had the Red Summer of 1919, in which groups of whites attacked black communities in various cities across America. Then you had the Tulsa Massacre. But during this period of time, for some reason, there weren't that many attacks on these places. The biggest attack came from the government in the building of the interstate highway system. Yeah, that was the biggest attack, because they decided the slum clearance meant that they wanted to not clear slums, but take away all the black communities. And they literally did that in city after city after city. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. A guy back there. Yeah.
First off, I just want to say I was absolutely moved by your story and your passion today.
Thank you.
As somebody who spent about 10 years of my childhood growing up in far eastern Tennessee, I have noticed in my adult years I've had to find myself taking up the responsibility to do this research on Black history and really learn what I can do nowadays. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you had any recommendations for any other pieces of literature that maybe inspired this journey or your career thus far.
Oh, yes. Funny you should ask me that. I was just asked that question by a website literally on Monday of last week. I think you have to read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It is a phenomenal book. I think it is probably the most moving account of the Great Migration. I think that another book that's really important is by Gretchen Sorens called Driving While Black in America. And she takes the same information and presents it in a different way. It's also a PBS series, so you can also watch the series. Another book that I like, I'm going to give you my email address after this, and you can write me, and I will be able to pull them all off the top, because right now I can't remember the other 3 that are on my list that I sent to this website. They're going to be available because they're featuring a little article about my book, and they want to know what other books I've read recently that moved me deeply about Black history. And I can give you the others. Yes.
I looked into this a few years ago, and I don't remember getting a definite answer, but I believe that Stevens Point was a sundown town at one point in our history.
Probably.
And if that is true, is there anything we can do at this point, not to make up for it, but to memorialize it or honor it or dishonor it in some way?
That's a really interesting question. I have to think about that. I think just saying it is sufficient. I think sometimes you just have to say what the truth is. And saying the truth, in essence, sets you free of the truth. Pretending that it wasn't is worse than saying it was, but it's now no longer. I think that's the freedom in saying that. I know so many places that are sundown towns who will never say it. Miami Beach was a sundown town. Fort Lauderdale was a sundown town. You have all these places like that that still have that history but will never say it. So I think what you've just done and the fact that you recognize it and you're willing to say it, that's the freedom. You've given the freedom with that. Yes. And then a guy back there. Okay, the guy back there first. Okay.
I just wanted to say that I'm a very big fan of travel. Would it be okay for someone such as myself to go and go to these places and learn about them and kind of, obviously I don't know if I'd be able to experience in the same way, but just see the places for myself and go along with what the Green Book is saying, or go to
Yes.
these different places?
In that case, I'd recommend that you buy a book by Candace Taylor. Candace Taylor did a book in which she photographed all of the existing Green Book locations. But what I think is really important, if there's a restaurant near there, or you stop into the restaurant and you talk to the people there, therefore you'll get more of what it is like, what it was like during that period of time. I cannot tell you there was a great joy when we ran into the shoeshine guy, Dennis, on Ferris Street. He was sensational. The interview was sensational, the way he described growing up on Ferris Street as a little boy, shining shoes, and how the people would come in and he would say the names of the local towns and they'd all come to Ferris Street and what it was like. He had seen it all. And that's the type of conversation you can have with somebody while you're having your shoes shine, and just give him a big tip. He'll be happy for that. Go to a restaurant. So you can visit those areas and you can get some of that feeling and some of that information on your own. And literally, in most of these places, they're fairly isolated, so there's nothing there. There's almost nothing there. Yeah.
Thanks again for sharing this important history and for your message and the enthusiasm with which you do it. For me, what I do is I teach students in qualitative research. I'm a qualitative researcher, so collecting stories and sharing information, and so much of what you shared was so reminiscent of that. But one of the interesting things about doing this kind of work is that the researcher is also changed by collecting these stories. So I'm curious, how has this experience and how has this changed you?
Oh my goodness. As Lee in the class this morning can tell you, there's some stories I can't go near. Even all this time afterwards, I can't go near the stories. They're too difficult. So they live in me every day. But what it has given me is a deeper understanding of the news and current events. You see much more distinctly how current events come from a long, long history. And sometimes that history is right next to you, as in your closest friend. That has been the most difficult. Recently, a close friend said something to me about the conflict in the Middle East. And that statement only needed one word changed to apply to me. One word. So you knew that it had been said before. So it changes you in that way. You're much more aware of it. I am highly supportive of Black entrepreneurs, highly supportive. I tell every one of them, I was a reluctant entrepreneur. I was one of those guys who had a great job at the New York Institute of Finance, which was owned by Simon & Schuster. And I got laid off from that job. And then I had 29 job interviews. I couldn't get a job. So I had to start a company if I was going to keep going. And so I was a reluctant entrepreneur. And then I kept my company going for almost 25 years. And I did well for 25 years. And I had learned, and I did not go to business school. I was practical. I think a lot of business is practical experience. And I learned everything I needed. So now I give all that information away. So that's what it's made me. I don't view any of my experience as being something I want to take to the grave. My goal is to give it all away. So when I take my last breath, it's all gone. And I want to help everybody else take that experience and make themselves more successful, more wise, and help change a greater degree of the world. That's what I hope. Yes, ma'am.
You were mentioning like the present time
Yes.
and news and everything and its influence. Now, we've seen the shootings of George Floyd,
Yes.
and we hear about arrests where Black people don't even have to do anything and they're shot to death, or some of them might step on the gas and speed away. Is that all related to what happened during segregation?
Yes. One of the stories I told this morning was about collateral damage. When I told the story about the little boy saying, look, they're calling dad a boy. And you have to think about the collateral damage. The children who see these experiences, what fear it embeds in them. The African guy who got stopped by the police and started to run. That's all because of fear of what's going to happen. So the collateral damage is there. You're skeptical from the very beginning about how that interaction is going to take place. And you can't get rid of that because you've seen too much. And especially when you know that before the cell phone, that there was a lot more that was not reported. That is in the culture, and it's part of what we learn. So I think it will take years for it to go away. I think and it's almost town by town. It's almost town by town. And so, but again, by mentioning it and talking honestly about it, I think that gives people a way to sort of deal with their frustration and associated with these things. But I hear it a lot and I see it a lot. Yes.
Thanks.
And then it's martini time?
I'm with you.
Libation.
It does not surprise me that you said the BBC picked this up and wanted to do this with you. It does surprise me that PBS didn't. December 7th, 1964, Martin Luther King made a speech, but it wasn't in America. It was in Great Britain. He talked about how the system was broken, not just here in America, but the system was broken in England. The civil rights struggle in England is not talked about at all. We think about it just being here in America, but the civil rights struggle was one that was conducted all over the world. Right. And Great Britain had a great deal of colonies, including in South Africa, that they oversaw. And Martin Luther King went and spoke to thousands of people that day. And it was a very diverse crowd, mostly white though, who agreed with him that the system was broken. I wonder, did they have anything when you went over and talked to them about the Green Book? Did they have anything such as this in Great Britain, which they used?
They did not. They did not have the Green Book in Great Britain. Remember, the Green Book is really word of mouth. It started out as word of mouth. It was initially passed along. If you were a fraternity member, you'd share it with your fraternity brothers. If you were a high school principal, there was an association of black high school principals, they would share the information. And you look at all of these social groups, whether it was the Black Masons or whatever, there were networks of home economics teachers. Think about all of these games that would take place at the HBCUs. Where did these black people came to these games stay? At the houses of local people, which was a part of the big network. The Green Book really was the print version of that network that long existed. And Victor had the ability not only to show resistance in creating it, but resilience and promotional skills in keeping it going. I'll tell you, and your question about Britain is good for another reason. I've been working in Britain since 1997. And the one thing I know and I'm certain of is about the racial difference. I probably would never have had the career that I had in the UK in America. I don't think it would ever have happened. The fact that it continues and lasts so long is also amazing to me. And my friendships there are much more diverse than they are in America. And I think here's the central reason. In Britain, racism remains a moral flaw. When you hear people, when people say something to you that's racist, British people will in general speak out. They're not shy about it. So, wow. But in America, racism has become a personality trait. Uncle John, he keeps his lawn so nice. He keeps his car nice. He sends his children to high school. And yes, he's a little racist. It's a personality trait. So with that, people are willing to tolerate it and not see it as something pernicious, just something a little odd. That's a big difference. And I see that again and again, working into two countries, when I give talks, it is always that difference. And people over there feel it more deeply. That could change in time. And I'm sure there's a whole group of people who view it as a personality trait too, and an entitlement even worse, much worse. But that personality trait thing stays with me because you see people in Britain accepting it, and in the UK accepting it in ways that I don't think many people in Britain would.
All right, thank you everyone for your insightful and thoughtful questions. So please give another hand of applause for Mr. Alvin Hall. Woo!
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I know I've seen a few hands in the back that you want to ask questions, but the good news is we will have, after our closing remarks, we will have meet and greet and book signing from 5:30 to 6:30 following the closing remarks. So if you do have a copy of your book, you can get it personally signed by Mr. Hall later on in a bit. So at this time, it's my pleasure to bring up my colleague, dynamic colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Martin, to do closing remarks. Please welcome Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, and thank you to Alvin for sharing the stories of resistance and resilience that I know we will remember for a very long time. And thank you also for your personal work in this area, and it's going so far in preserving the stories. That's just so important work, so thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank one more time our sponsors, which would be the Thompson Center, as well as the Century School of Business and Economics, and the Office of Diversity and College Access. And then one of my most important job, well, Dr. Sam already stole my line, was to tell you about the refreshments. So after a short break, Alvin will be joining us out in the area by the fireplace, where he will take the time to sign your book. If you want to say hello, or if you had a question that you didn't have a chance to ask, please join us out there and enjoy some refreshments as well. And then lastly, for the students who are here for Pro Events credits, we will have our interns set up with their laptops just outside the door there. So if you're here for a Pro Events credit, make sure you sign in there. So thank you again, everybody, and let's thank Alvin one more time. Thank you.